Session partner, Oxycaru presents Narrating the Nation, Writing History Between Empire and Republic.
By Manu Pillai in conversation with V S Kaikasi.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join your hands and welcome speakers on stage. Thank you.
Welcome to this session with the versatile writer Manu Pillai. Our session is actually titled Narrating the Nation, Writing History Between Empire and Republic. But I'll have to say something about the something about the author first. Now, all of us know that history is a very interesting subject, but in our schools it may not have been introduced properly. So what happened was that it finally became one of the most boring subjects. So here we have a person who has actually made it very, very interesting so that history has become the most happening subject around. So here is Manu Pillai, who has been writing those incredible works of non-fiction which everybody reads. Now, I don't think I need an introduction to this author. He almost banged into the field with actually a book titled Ivory Throne. I remember going for the launch of this book, and he was sitting in one corner, a small, young, charismatic, charming, handsome boy. And I was wondering whether this is a historian.
I must say, the way you're referring to me as a boy makes it sound like you're 20 years older than me, which is simply not true.
No, but normally we have these common perceptions about historians. See, they should have a prerequisite that is gray hairs.
I have some now.
He's too modest to say that, but just look at him. He's so handsome. He's a gym-going historian. I think perhaps the only one in that league who has actually made it a very interesting topic to discuss about. And also, one nice thing about him is that we have Romila Thapar saying history is not a boring subject. She has said that past is not a static entity. It is something that is dynamic, and it interferes in our present, and also it shapes our future identities. So that is why history is not one of those boring subjects. It is, he has made it what we call as a popular historian. He has made it appealing to everyone. He has made it, he and also his league of writers have actually made that, history is everyone's cup of tea, and it is one subject that all of us should be reading extensively, whatever our literary preferences may be, and it should be discussed. It should be discussed more often and more frequently than what is happening right now. In fact, as I said, I will be a fool if I have to introduce his books to you. He banged with this one book, that is called Ivory Throne, The Chronicles of Travancore History, where he talks about a person who was almost sidelined in Travancore history. So with that book, he entered the field. And to prove that, he's not a one-book wonder, for that book, he has actually won the Yuva Sahitya Puraskar of Sahitya Academy. And his second book is actually History of the Deccan region. You have from the Khilji era to the Shivaji era, and that too written, personally I feel it is the most structured and well-planned book of Manu. And then comes my favorite book, which I have the honor of teaching to a student in a very culturally sensitive area, where I'll be taking classes on topics like the Muslim deity in the Hindu temple and so on. This is actually a very interesting book where he talks about nuggets of historical tales in a very interesting fashion. You can start this book at any point and end it in any point. It is not a continuation. You have fragments of history woven together. It's a very interesting book. And then he, later in 2019, he has actually published this book titled False Allies, which is again the story of Maharajas in the era of Raja Ravivarma, the renowned painter. And finally, we have Gods, Guns and Missionaries, the most happening book of our times, which is already a bestseller, which actually traces the evolution of Hindutva, or the rise of Hindutva during the Indian colonial period. So this is his trajectory of books. What an illustrious writer, and that too at this very young age. So we are very, very happy to have Manu here. Welcome, Manu.
Thank you, Kaikasi, for the very generous introduction.
So I would like to ask, or begin by asking you, you have historians undertake a great mission of talking about, something which will finally culminate in narrating a nation. So sometimes they accidentally or they, intentionally make some deletions and additions, which will have an impact on our understanding of history. So what do you think is the mission of a historian in these times?
Well, the mission of a historian is actually not to narrate the nation as I see it, because the moment you start getting into contributing to a national narrative or a sort of uniform narrative for the country and for our people and all of that, then obviously you end up making a selection of certain things as you were indicating and ignoring perhaps other things that don't fit the narrative. In terms of shaping that kind of narrative of history, it's politicians who do it best. It's people who work in the public field who do it. People who are invested in history in a very emotional sense, who want to use history not necessarily as a subject where you inquire and you study, but as something that you use to navigate the present and to sort of change the present and shape the future in a certain way. So that's not really the job of a historian. A historian is supposed to look at history in a far more dispassionate fashion. There are no heroes and villains when you look at history that way. Emotionally, for me as a person, when I read something, there may be heroes and villains. But when I study those historical figures, I'm supposed to suspend that framework of heroes and villains and look at them as creatures who existed in a specific time and moment and behaved in a certain way. And you then investigate why they behaved that way, what the world was in their time, things like that. For that, you have to keep a little bit of a distance. You have to keep your emotions at bay. And you need to therefore attend to the subject with an analytical kind of mind. So a good historian is somebody who at least attempts to do that. I'm not making the claim that any historian fully succeeds in this, because again, we are also people who are raised at a certain period of time in history. Our gender, our family backgrounds, education, the economic background you come from, the caste background you come from, all of these things affect the way even historians behave. What subjects interest them, what approaches they take, what perspectives they bring. We are also conditioned by all of this. So we can never claim that we've completely got rid of the emotional element in history, but we make an effort to try and be dispassionate. But in today's world, yes, there are plenty of people who believe that that's not necessarily what's needed, and that history can be studied in a much more emotional way to make the nation great, etc. Again, it's a democracy, it's a free world. There's room for that, and then there's room for other kind of history as well. At least that's the approach and attitude I take.
That also brings me back to the concept of studying history, especially as a school child. When we were learning history in the initial stages, it was very interesting. But later on, what actually happened was that you have to cram up everything. You have to study whether after Maurya who comes, after Babur who comes. So you are more concerned about all these data, and also it is very confusing that you have Sher Shah Suri has also minted coins. Some of them has actually, all of them have planted avenue trees. So it actually became a process where we are more on a learning path. You are just cramming up, not engaged in what you and other historians engage in. Like interesting stories, some gossips, some backdoor stories.
Not some, there's so much gossip in history.
So
full of gossip.
Suddenly, history has become a very, very special subject for all of us. So, what do you think is the problem of teaching history in schools, and how can you make it very interesting? And how did you actually got hooked up to history?
So, since you mentioned gossip, I got interested in history because of some naughty stories. I remember, and this is a question I keep getting asked a lot, and it's just that every time I went to Kerala, to my ancestral home, my grandmother would tell us, stories about her uncles and her grandmother and things like that. Her grandmother had a first marriage, which was this great love story with this Brahmin, which was very sweet to hear. A kind of tragic love story because they had to part, but that was interesting. So, and I remember being told about my grandmother's eldest uncle. His name was Parameshwaran, and he was supposedly a very fierce, one of those chauvinistic, feudal lord type of people. And there's this story my grandmother told me at one point. She's like, oh, my uncle Parameshwaran married 4 times. And I was like, wow, that's very, prolific, 4 wives and all of that. And she said, no, he didn't have 4 wives at the same time. It was one after the other. So I said, wait, why did he get rid of the first 3 wives? And it turned out that he first married and brought home a lady, and somebody, apparently the manager of the household said, Ayo, is that your wife? From a distance, I thought it was your mother. And the chauvinist in him was so upset that his freshly brought home wife looked as old as his mother that he said, off with her, and sent her back to her house. And in those days in Kerala, you could dissolve marriages like that because it was called sambandham. It was just a relationship, you could dissolve at will. Then he brought another lady, and apparently somebody made some comment about her teeth being not perfect, so he discarded her. The third one he brought, and I remember the story, is that to go into the courtyard, they used to wear these wooden slippers in those days called mediyadis in Kerala. And usually the eldest male member of the family used to wear it in the house. Others could wear it outside, but in the house only the eldest male member used to wear it. But this lady was apparently very fashionable and beauty conscious, and she used to curl her hair and all of that. We're talking 1910s maybe. And apparently very stylish, and two of her nieces later became Malayalam actresses. So, the style and fashion ran in the family. But to step into the courtyard, she wore the mediyadis and stepped out. And this, again, chauvinist great uncle of mine got very upset, saying, when I'm in the house, who's walking around in the mediyadi? And it turned out it was his new wife. So he said, well, I like her a lot, but this is more arrogant. She's more arrogant than I can handle. And so he got rid of her also. And then finally he stuck to the fourth one, because I think he was also getting a bit exhausted. And she also had a lot of land and money, which he spent the rest of his days squandering. So listening to stories like this just suddenly made me realize that there is a world of human experience in history that is outside of the textbooks with their 5 dates and 6 empires and 20 kings. There is something happening here, because although it's a comical story of this uncle and his 4 marriages, my question then was, wait, how did these marriages get dissolved so easily? So then that led me into this whole concept of the Sambandham form of marriage in Kerala, where people could divorce, where people could dissolve marriages at will. His sister, as it happened, dissolved her marriage with her first husband as well. So women also had the privilege, not just men. So that small family anecdote made me think of something like this. Another thing is, which is a story I often tell, is about how my grandmother herself, she told me once how in her childhood, in the 1940s, women, when they had their periods, still had to segregate themselves. They had to sit in a separate room. And they were considered impure during those days, so they couldn't go around the house. The food would come to them in the house, brought by a specific person, and nobody else would go there. And she used to hate this business of being called impure, because she also had an older brother who'd tease her saying, oh, you're impure for so many days. So apparently every time the rest of the family went for lunch, which was in a separate part of the house, she would step out of this impurity room, go around touching everything in the house, her father's desk, his munda, the granary, everything in the house that she could, make everything ashuddham, and then come and sit again safely in that room. It was a small kind of subversion. And I also remember that time connecting this with something I'd read, which was the memoirs of Devaki Nilangod, a Nambudiri Brahmin woman, who said that in their time, this was 20 years before my grandmother, that she also had to sit with the women in the family in this room when they had their periods. But being Nambudiri women, they were not allowed to go to school, they were not allowed to read certain kinds of literature, etc. They were literate, but they were not allowed to read newspapers or magazines or anything. But she talks in her memoirs about how that one room was where men did not come in and look at what they were doing, because it was impure. And that is where they used to read the newspapers, read the magazines, read books that was otherwise not permitted, they had no access to. So again, a small family anecdote leads you into understanding a social institution, and also how women who were at the receiving end or the suffering end of the social institution found ways to subvert it and push back against it, right under the nose of all their uncles and fathers and all the men in their lives. So you start realizing that actually there is an emotional texture, there is the texture of experience to history, which is not what gets encapsulated in textbooks. As for how teachers can, and school children can be taught history better, again, I have no great hopes with textbooks. Every time there's a new government, the material in the textbook changes. Kings are kicked out, new kings are brought in, battles lost become battles won. All of that sort of thing happens. So I don't think textbooks are the right way to encourage an interest in history. Teachers can make a big difference. I think even with the worst textbooks, if you have a good teacher, that can make a world of difference. And the other thing is just, encouraging people to understand the history around them. You don't have to, lately I've been telling people that you don't even need to go out into monuments, etc. Just go back home, sit down with your grandparents and ask them about the time when they were going to school. How did they live? They probably didn't wear similar uniforms as you. They lived in a time where people's hairstyles were still determined by caste and status. People did not take dabbas to school because you couldn't eat with everybody in school. You had to, eat your meal separately based on caste. So you don't even need to go and read a book. You can just ask elders in your family about their life experiences, and history will come alive in front of your eyes. So I think that's the style I encourage, partly because that's how I got interested in history.
So, have you ever ruffled any feathers in your family through your writing, especially about these kind of things, spicy
Oh
details
yeah,
that
yeah,
you are doing?
plenty. But again, because I have my grandmother watching my back, she doesn't censor anything. And since she's the eldest person in the family, and if she's perfectly okay with telling me all the naughty secrets, to be fair, there's a history to this. When my great-grandfather was dying, apparently, around 1993, he sat my grandmother down, and she's the youngest daughter in the family, and he's very close to her and very fond of her. And this dying great-grandfather of mine sat her down and told her all the family gossip and family secrets, saying that now that I'm dying, someone else in the family needs to know what these secrets are. And I am now the receiving party in the sense that my grandmother has now transmitted all the gossip to me, so that, again, another generation knows where all the skeletons are buried.
So this is a generational gossip. That
We're a generation of naughty people, yes.
No, coming back to what you said earlier, about textbooks and all that, you have this history being almost like a propaganda thing. You have historians undertaking the profession. As a profession, they are taking up the job of, just like you said, kicking out kings and all that. And academics are also responding to that by having textbooks specifically brought it that way. Kerala government has actually decided to teach that those specific portions which are omitted in the NCERT test. So how do you look at, in this scenario, how do you want to be remembered?
Look, a lot of history itself is propaganda in the sense that anytime you look at material commissioned in, say, Emperor Akbar's court, or the material written by Abul Fazl, one of his closest courtiers and friends, Abul Fazl is not writing an objective history. He wants to flatter Akbar, he wants to communicate an image of Akbar, that Akbar is this great sovereign and iconic, semi-divine figure and all of that. So much of the historical material historians deal with, especially of certain classes of people when it comes to politics, kings, empires, political history, it's already a form of propaganda because histories have for the longest time been written by elites. Histories of ordinary people are often not written down. They are in other sources in terms of song and lore and traditions, etc. But a lot of the written historical material we get is already a form of propaganda one way or the other. A good historian knows how to negotiate that and try to sort of cull out the interesting parts, bring out the juice without falling for the propaganda. But what you're saying is essentially today's court historians. Today also these are people who are writing histories like this, very much like the old court historians, either to flatter or to build up a certain narrative, etc. And as I said earlier, that will always be the case. I don't think we're ever going to live in a time where there isn't going to be someone doing non-objective or agenda-driven history or whatever.
So what will be your ideal definition of a good historian?
See, I don't want to make a general definition of that nature. As I said, if somebody attempts or has, at least at the core, their motivation is to be objective, their motivation is to understand the subject, not judge a subject, and then approach history, that is, I think, a fair approach. You may not always succeed, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because we are also flawed human beings. So I'm very aware that something I conclude today, 25 years later might get revised by somebody else. Not because what I've done is wrong, it's just that what I'm doing is based on the perspectives and frameworks that are available to me today, here and now. 20 years later, there may be new perspectives in play that we are oblivious to, we haven't even thought of. What then? So a lot of those conclusions will get revised. So even earlier generations of historians, I don't think, while we are constantly revising their conclusions, but we do it respectfully because we're not sitting there saying, oh, they were all horrible historians. No, it's just that they lived in a time and age that they had only these resources to deal with the history. A lot of material was not accessible to them. We now have greater access to material because the world has shrunk. You can get digitized records from America, you can get it from the National Archives in Delhi, newspapers have been digitized. So it's easier now to find material compared to their generation, where they had to painstakingly go to each of these places. And you're likely to miss a lot because you don't have the financial resources, things like that. So long as you make an effort to be an objective sort of party and don't get swayed one way or the other, I think that's a good enough effort. You're not always going to succeed, but then there are some who are willing to be swayed, and that's where the difference lies, I think.
Now, let us come to his latest book, Guns, Gods and Missionaries, which is actually a colossal book, both in terms of content and also it looks very huge, it's very bulky in that sense. This book actually traces the trajectory of Hinduism or Hindutva, and it pauses at a particular point. That is the end of the colonial period. I was reminded of this film Pushpa, which has three parts. We have already seen two parts. You have Pushpa the rise, then Pushpa the rule, and Pushpa the rampage is being awaited. So you have spoken about Pushpa the rise of Hindutva. The rule you have not mentioned, the rampage has not been mentioned. See, you have the most violent phase of Hinduism much later, the post-independence period. So can we expect, just like this franchise, a second and a third part, or are you okay with it?
I don't know if I should be flattered or not that you're comparing my work to a particular movie. I'll choose to be flattered and not offended.
Allu Arjun won a national award for that.
Oh, well, national awards these days, let's not go into that topic either. You and I are both Malayalis, and we saw what movie got the Best Director award. Kerala Story, none of us will recognize. But the point is, no, I didn't choose to come into...
Actually, I meant to flatter,
No, I got that. Thank you. Also, I'm the type who enjoys flattery, so you can do that. But the point is, on present-day Hindutva, there are heaps of books that already exist, and there are heaps of scholars better than me, more qualified than me, who've already done it. One of my PhD supervisors was a man called Christoph Jafferlo, who's written since the 90s on the Hindutva movement. Just look at all of his work. And if I were to now approach it, I don't know what original thought or insight I would be able to contribute. What interested me was a missing piece of the puzzle in the prehistory of Hindutva. Nothing emerges out of thin air. Even Hindutva, it doesn't matter if you like it or dislike it. Even if you dislike Hindutva, the point is it's emerged out of certain social impulses. And impulses like that are not just created overnight by one person. Savarkar did not wake up in the morning, write a book called Hindutva, and the rest of the world fell in line. Savarkar only voiced something in a potent way for something, and a phenomenon that was already bubbling around in different ways, but hadn't been articulated yet. And he was able to give it its enduring articulation. That is essentially what we now call Hindutva. But before him, there were others who tried to define that very term, who tried to create a definition of politically aroused Hinduism or Hindu identity, a very political one. And I was interested in that prehistory. Okay. What were the dynamics that got these people to think about Hindutva as Hindu-ness, as a politically alert idea of Hindu identity. And there I realized a big piece of the puzzle that we were missing was the encounter between Hinduism and Hindus with Christianity and Christian missionaries in the colonial period, from the Portuguese period onwards. Because much of the study of Hindutva is, we view it through the prism of Hindu-Muslim relations, because that is what dominates our conversations today. And of course, in the colonial period also, it's an important element, but there's a bit of presentism in that, to view Hindutva purely through Hindu-Muslim relations. Whereas to me, it looked like a lot of the conceptual arsenal of Hindutva actually comes out of the encounter with the colonial state and with Christianity and Christian missionaries. Okay. So Christians and Christian missionaries never converted millions of people in India, but because we had a colonial state in the country, we had white people ruling much of the country, their attitudes and concepts had a disproportionate influence, whether it's in education, because a lot of modern English education that India's elites in the 19th century got was through Christian mission schools. A lot of the literature they were reading was inflected by Christian impulses, etc. Their idea of morality, Victorian morality, is a very Protestant kind of Christian morality, which a lot of Hindus also absorbed and internalized, and we're still living often with the consequences of that. So I thought that important missing piece of the puzzle is what I wanted to address and write about. Not go into territory that has already been done to death and studied quite extensively by lots of people. I'm sure more books will come out on that subject. My only question in front of me was towards the end of the book. Initially, I thought the epilogue would bring the story down to the present, and I'd probably talk about some of the present day dynamics. But then I myself decided not to do that for two reasons. One is that, again, it leaves the realm of history and goes into a kind of journalism, which again I felt I'm not comfortable doing. But the other important thing also is that the book is not about Hindutva. The book is about modern Hinduism, and Hindutva is one aspect of it. To end the book purely fixated on Hindutva would make it suggest that Hindutva is the end point and conclusion of this long historical process, which is not true. Hindutva is again one small or one significant element in it, but it is not the totality. And we should not sometimes, inadvertently overestimate the powers of Hindutva by giving it that kind of push. So I was like, my book is about modern Hinduism. In that, Hindutva is a component, but the story itself is not about Hindutva. So I don't want to exaggerate the importance of Hindutva by making that the ending point of the book. So the end point of the book again goes back to Hinduism itself and what modern Hinduism is all about.
Okay, and you've done an incredible job with that. If you have seen the book, more than the content, you have an extensive set of notes that you have prepared, which actually shows what kind of a historian he is,
Oh no, that was also, I mean, yes, there's a lot of material in the notes, 250 pages.
250
but that's also because I didn't want to get sued by anybody. Again, given the kind of, national Olympic sport we've turned of taking offense in this country. I didn't want that. As you know, my very first book got me a 5 crore defamation notice. So since then, I've been very clear that let me put all my sources in the book itself, even if it takes 250 pages. Penguin was not very happy because they were like, oh, can you reduce the notes? And I said, absolutely not. The notes have to stay.
So has the Travancore royal family pardoned you? Like, Charles Darwin was pardoned after many years for talking about evolution.
They didn't pardon me. I sent them a notice right back. And then they dropped the matter. That's what happened. So I'd like to believe that I scared them off, that they didn't really pardon me. If you come at me with a danda, I've also got a danda to offer in return.
Yes, so coming to, recently I read a review of Sam Dalrymple's recent book, the first debut book, Shatterlands, which has got a very evocative title because he's talking about partition, and in that he talks about the role of Hindu nationalism and also Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS. So which brings me back to this question, do you think that it is very nice to just leave those wounds that are not actually healed, but have been conveniently stitched for a while, and not take it out and make it, a kind of a topic for debate and discussion? So do you think that a historian, when he leaves certain things, he's doing a service, or do you think that it is a disservice?
Again, the job of the historian is not to do any kind of service when it comes to these social things. The job of the historian is to study something. This, again, played on my mind because when I was doing Gods, Guns and Missionaries, at one point, somebody did ask me saying, oh, what if some of the contents of the book, because there is a segment, for example, the very first chapter is about Portuguese excesses in Goa. And there was violence. It was a very stringent, fanatical kind of Catholic, Christianity, really persecuting Hindus in that period in Goa. You can't get away from the facts. And Goans are aware of it. They made their peace with it. Today they celebrate their religious festivals together. They've moved on from that. But that historical dynamic, everybody there is aware of. Because even now there are churches you go and you know that this used to be a temple at one point and was then turned into a church. So there were people who told me that, oh, what if this is used to target minorities today? And I remember having conversations with a bunch of people, including some senior scholars, saying, how do I address this? And they said, look, it's not your job to address that. As an individual, you may feel discomfort, but your job is to stay true to your subject and approach it and study it, examine it, and say things if it's inconvenient, either way. And I was pretty convinced that different sections of the book would get me branded left, right, etc. by different people, and that's happened also. My ex-boss, Shashi Tharoor, got a very angry email from somebody in Chennai saying, this is the most anti-Brahmin book. I was like, okay, point number one. Tick,
Which
first box has been
ticked.
ticked. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is funny because someone else wrote or tweet on Twitter saying you've become a Brahminic apologist for Brahmins. So I'm getting both anti-Brahminical and Brahmin apologist. Then someone wrote to me saying, oh, this is an anti-Christian book. I was like, okay. But funnily enough, one of the first people to receive a copy of the book was a bishop in Pune who told me that, no, this is, perfectly fine and all of that. So those responses have come, but again, one of the advantages of getting older is that in my 20s, I would have been rattled by this. In my 30s, I really don't care. Because I've realized that if somebody's going to sue you, they're going to sue you anyway. If they're going to throw stones at you, they're going to throw stones at you anyway. I can't do my work being afraid of all of this. I can't do my work being afraid of what different constituencies on Twitter will call me at a certain season or a certain moment. I just have to stay true to my subject. And so long as you have a basic integrity and you know that what your duty deserves or requires is for you to focus on the subject and say the inconvenient thing if that is needed, then you just stick to that and then hope for the best, and hopefully I won't get stoned.
Let us take a break from all this serious stuff. I'll just want to ask you a very trivial question. If you get a chance to go on a date with a historical figure from Indian history, who will?
Oh, you're getting very naughty. I think
a simple dinner date, okay? Don't get your imagination wild.
Nothing romantic.
Nothing romantic.
I think the protagonist of my first book certainly is somebody I would have enjoyed meeting. Partly because this way that story transfixed me, the story of Sethu Lakshmibai, who died here in Bangalore in 1985. There's a lot in that I feel I still haven't completely mined. Because when I was pretty young, I published that book at 25, started researching at 19. And in those 6 years, although I got a lot of the archival material out and all of that, trying to get inside the mind of a person who was so shy, so reserved, so unwilling to be in the limelight was a particular kind of challenge. So she achieved a great deal. She was a reluctant kind of public figure. And then she sort of vanishes from the record and literally dies in obscurity in a completely different part of the country. And trying to get inside her mind is something I tried then, and I still feel that there's a lot that I haven't managed to uncover. So since that is a question mark in my mind, it's very likely I would choose to probably have dinner with Sethu Lakshmibai. But again, knowing what I do of her character, she'd probably have a very polite dinner and answer none of my questions.
So only that, no one else.
I mean, there's someone called Ivan the Terrible, who I've always wanted to meet because that's such a wonderful moniker, no? Ivan the Terrible. I mean, that sounds very nice. If try to attach anything like that to my name, firstly, my name doesn't lend itself for that kind of thing. Manu the something doesn't work. Because it's in that sense, I always regret my parents named me Manu. They could have given me a name with more gravitas, which they chose not to. But yeah, Ivan the Terrible.
They must have named you as the first human or something like that.
Manava, the root, Manu, yeah. Of course, most people associated with Manu Smriti. So I got cancelled once for that also on Twitter, saying, aren't you ashamed of having a name that celebrates the Manu Smriti? And I was like, I didn't give myself this name. And I only got the Manu because my father wanted an M, so he and I would have the same initials. So it was as flimsy a reason as that. But yeah, in today's world, one can get cancelled for anything.
So you have a very active Instagram account, you are active on Twitter, and you are writing a book, and you are going for all these events. How do you manage all this?
I think time management is all it takes. It doesn't...
And you're going to the gym?
On that, without question. No, but I think time management really makes a big difference there. Actually, it's not as if I'm on social media that much. For example, when I'm sitting down to work, which is usually 8:30 in the morning, I keep my phone in the same room, but in a completely different part of the room. So it's in the corner. It's always on silent. So if the phone is not near you, in the radius of where your arm can reach, then you're not that tempted to actually check social media. But every hour and a half, I get up and walk for 10 minutes up and down the room. And often, this is it's a personal quirk of mine, which is that if I've written something, when I'm walking up and down, I'm also saying it aloud to myself to see if the argument makes sense. So if anyone were to look in through the window, they'd just see this man walking up and down the room talking to himself. But that's what I do. And at that time, I go and look at my phone and then I see whatever's happening. Twitter, I actually don't check during the day. Once in the morning for what's happening in the world, news and stuff. And once in the evening, safely an hour before bed, never exactly at bedtime. Because then if you get some nasty tweet, it can agitate you and my sleep goes for a toss. So then I always make sure there's a 1 hour gap between my last engagement with Twitter and bed. But again, I don't tweet that much. It's only on Instagram that I'm fairly active, and that's also because it's a slightly cleaner platform. There are trolls there. There are people who send nasty messages. But the funny thing is, once you mute them, they can keep commenting, but nobody else can see the comments. And that's very empowering, that feeling, knowing that this person's just going crazy, abusing you on your post, but nobody can see it. And they're getting more and more frustrated because they're not getting likes. And I enjoy looking at that.
So Manu, we are both from MAHE. So there are a few, very few books on the history of MAHE because it's a very regional space, and though historical works have been written, but nothing in detail. My grandmother tells me a lot of stories which are about a ghost, all those yakshis and all that. So have you ever thought of, you've always been writing books, on a larger canvas. You have a large framework for everything. So have you ever thought of writing something local? The local historian in you has...
It's quite funny you should ask this question because I'm toying in my mind. I've got a great story to tell, but I'm toying in my mind whether I should do it as a kind of non-fiction local history of a certain village, my own ancestral village, or whether I should do it as a work of fiction. Which I haven't written fiction in at least 20 years, so it's a gamble for me. But it is a very local story. It is a very rural story because my ancestors are rural. My father's father was a farmer in Kerala. My mother's family they were landlords, but they were also part of an agrarian economy. So we still have our property there. We still go there every year. I have a house there. We still have those networks in the village with the communities that have lived there. So I'm in that sense both an outsider and an insider. Since from my childhood I've known all of them, but I don't permanently live there, so I'm also a bit of an outsider. So that does excite me in a certain way, but I don't know when I'll be able to do it.
I remember reading that article on Nangeli. You remember long back you've written that, and that was a very interesting take on the concept of Nangeli, which is narrated in a very different way in our circles. So that brings me back to the question, you have a lot. We in our present day system, we have been teaching students a lot on this caste resistance, Dalit movements and so on. So there is one section of teachers who actually believe that let us stop teaching them so that the next generation of students will never realize that, their ancestors had a past and they live in a world which is actually free from all these prejudices. The other narrative is also there. They should be knowing all that. So you should learn Dalit movements and Dalit resistance and so on. So again, what is your take on that, How do you look at this?
So I think we have to study everything in history without reserve. So in that sense, we have to examine caste, we have to examine the oppressive side of it, we have to at the same time understand how it emerged, who sustained it, why it was sustained, etc. Again, an institution like that survives for so many 2,000, 2,500 odd years, not simply because one set of people was oppressing everybody else. It meant that most people were able to have some kind of stake in the caste order, which is why that framework was able to survive. Okay. So I think that's an interesting question to ask, right? Like, what is it that persuaded so many people in Indian society? Excepting the people at the extreme bottom, everybody else had somebody above them, but also somebody they could oppress or somebody who's below them. So even among the marginalized castes, you do have a hierarchy within that, right? And it's only the lowest who have the pressure of everybody on them, and they simply don't have the resources to stand up. Everybody else has their own, somebody they're oppressing at the same time that they're also being oppressed. And I think we need to also tackle some of those questions. I don't think avoiding the topic allows society to move forward. That's never really worked anywhere. Even in a country like Germany that had its experience with the Nazis, etc., they tackle it head on. Children are taught about it in their textbook. They learn that this is what happened in their country, and a couple of generations were misled by a rather toxic ideology. So you have to confront these things head on. The problem, though, is that just as, say, the Savarnas have certain narratives that become romanticized, all political movements, once they become entrenched in certain ways, certain mythologies emerge. And those mythologies can sometimes be punctured by historians, and again, historians get called names at that time. With the Nangeli story you mentioned, I got cancelled comprehensively in Kerala by the left in that instance, because I had countered some of the claims in that story. So for those who don't know, there's a story about an Irava woman in Kerala called Nangeli, early 19th century, where the narrative goes that in those days, lower caste women were not allowed to cover their breasts. And in order to cover their breasts, they had to pay a certain tax called the breast tax. And the narrative also says that the tax collectors would come and they would measure women's breasts to determine the scope of the tax, etc. Firstly, this never really convinced me entirely, because anybody who studied that period, say 200 years ago of India, forget 200 years ago, today, we simply did not have the state capacity for people to go around measuring people's body parts. There was no state capacity of that nature. Tax collection, etc., happened in a very fragmented way. There was no centralized power in those days sitting there with centralized bureaucrats going out measuring people's bodies. That was physically it was not something states could afford in those days. So there was a question mark over there. But then we have a heap of visual evidence showing that not just women of marginalized castes, but upper caste women in Kerala were also walking around topless. I have a great-grandmother, we have a photograph of her where she's got a thing on her shoulder, but her right breast is completely exposed, because the cloth on the shoulder is not used to cover the body. It's a mark of status. It's a mark of caste dominance, and she's saying that I belong to a landlord community, and therefore I have the cloth, but she's not covering her breasts. I have photographs of Nambudiri Brahmin women who are sitting topless. You can see very clearly the older women are topless. The younger ones in the 20th century are wearing blouses. So you can see the generational difference there. You have pictures of the Ranis of Cochin sitting enthroned in their armchairs, but again, completely topless. There's jewelry, but there's no fabric on their upper bodies. And recently I came across a book in which there's a photograph of a Syrian Christian woman as well, sitting topless with just a torta on one side of her body. No blouse, none of that. The chatte mundum that Christian women wore used to be when they went out to church. But at home, even they walked around topless. So it's interesting that there's so much visual evidence. You have evidence of the Dutch and the Portuguese, etc., meeting political, queens in Kerala in the 17th century. And they actually comment on the fact that these queens are walking around topless. You have a case of an Italian in the court of the Zamborin of Calicut, 1607 or 1605 or around then. where he says that the queen and her daughters entered and they just had these blue silk loincloths and lots of jewelry, but they weren't wearing any clothes. And funnily enough, the daughters of the queen came and touched this white man and said, why is he wearing so many clothes? Because in hot tropical Kerala, he was covered from neck to toe. So when you compile all the evidence, you start realizing that, hold on, there's something that is not fitting in the narrative. Also, the story itself of a woman cutting off her breasts, it is not specific to Nangeli. There is a tribal version of the story from a tribal hilly region where there's a story of a woman and somebody came to collect the tax and she cut off her breasts. So clearly the story is a motive and it's communicating something, which is resistance to an unjust caste-based tax thing. But the tax itself, once you start investigating, had nothing to do with covering breasts. There was something called a poll tax, which is each person has to pay. Usually it was charged in times of economic crisis. So if you were a fisherman, you'd be told that for every fishing net or a fishing chunda that you have to pay a certain tax. Or if you're, depending on your profession, you had to pay a poll tax for each person in the household or the community. And for men, the tax was called talakaram, health tax. And to distinguish women who paid a different rate, it was called molakaram or breast tax. That is how I have seen the evidence. And as I said, looking at the visual evidence, the evidence from foreigners, the photographic evidence down to the 20th century, you realize that women in Kerala were walking around topless, period. Not just marginalized caste women, but upper caste women also. In fact, once the European gaze came in and Europeans basically said, no, women have to be covered up a certain way. The women were still reluctant to wear blouses because the notion of modesty in Kerala was such that wearing the blouse was something only courtesans and harlots did. Because by wearing a blouse, you're drawing attention to the body by covering it up. Whereas no respectable woman would cover her body up because why? Why draw attention to your body like that? But because the European gaze came in and the blouse was considered not cool, women, especially in central Kerala, started taking a cloth and putting it across their shoulders and tucking it under their armpits like that. And you have lots of photos of the early 20th century generation of Cochin princesses, for example, dressed like that. No blouse. There is an upper cloth, but it's loosely held against the breasts, usually when they're posing for a camera or a photograph. And then that becomes their uniform for a certain period of time. In fact, somebody once told me that somehow these women with this thing held like that precariously in their armpit managed to play tennis also. But that's just how that form evolved. Then another generation started wearing blouses. In fact, the first Nambudiri Brahmin woman, her name was Parvati Nenminimangalam, to wear a blouse around 1930 was excommunicated from her caste for covering herself wearing a blouse. Because even Brahmin women were not permitted to wear the blouse. So when you have all this information, it is very difficult for me to swallow the narrative that Nangeli was standing up because she was not permitted to cover her breasts. She was standing up for an unjust tax. Yes, that story makes sense. But this covering of breasts doesn't make sense because even the Queen of Travancore was not covering her breasts at that time. So why would that be a matter of great offense to Nangeli? So that doesn't add up. But because the story has been mythologized and has become a very core part of the left's narrative in Kerala, I've been attacked as right-wing, etc. for puncturing this story. Meanwhile, the right things,
part of our collective narrative, we for everything we actually refer back to Nangeli and her protest and her resistance and so on. Now, if you there must be a time when you started, you had great affection for a historical character, and you started researching more on him, and he found out that he's not worthy of your respect or love or admiration. Is there any character like that?
I think in my teens, when I read a lot of biographies, there were people you were very impressed by. In those days, why go for anyone else? Even Gandhiji, right?
Yeah, Gandhiji,
you have a romantic narrative that you're fed. The good thing about Gandhiji is he himself wrote extensively. He wrote about everything from his sex life to his bowel movements. And because of that, there's a huge archive of this man's life that he himself put out there. And others have analyzed it, and you realize that, hold on,
but in that case, it was an autobiography, my experience with truth.
Even in his biographies, you have the standard biographies which are very worshipful in a certain way. And there's much he deserves, of course, credit for. Without him, we would not have had the freedom struggle in the way we did. But you realize that, hold on, everybody is ultimately a human being. And when you're a human being, you are bound to have flaws. And he had his flaws. At certain moments in his life, especially when he was a younger man in South Africa, he was pretty racist towards blacks. And he was deeply offended that Indians were categorized in the same group as blacks. And he said, no, we have to be separate, not equated with the blacks. And he would have preferred to be equated with the whites rather than the blacks. So there is a bit of racism then. The good thing with him is that at a later stage in his life, he also acknowledges that from his youth and says that I was wrong. So it's interesting that he himself recognizes the full arc there. In Kerala, we have the last Travancore Maharaja Chitra Tirunal, where people in Trivandrum are still very wedded to his this romanticized idea of him as Pratyaksha Padmanabhan, Lord Padmanabha in human form. But then I look at the archives and I see that this gentleman would not, the way he treated his aunt, the way he treated certain members of his family, not even letting go, once he became the last Raja and the Indian government handed over ownership of all the palaces to him, he would not even let go of the ownership of the palace where his aunt lived, saying that it's mine, not yours. Even though she built it, she lived there, her children were raised there, doesn't matter. And eventually he kept it for himself and was compensated for it, while she and her children lost essentially what they used to call as their home. So you realize that even Pratyaksha Padmanabha has feet of clay. You read a certain archival document, it's in Sridhar Menon's book, where there's a conference taking place with Ambedkar attending, and you see this gentleman writing that I don't think princes can sit at the level of equality with men like Ambedkar. So you realize, okay, he did have certain issues there as well. So you realize nobody who's been romanticized is ultimately some kind of superhuman figure. They're all flawed, they're all human, and that is fine. You and I are also flawed.
Yeah.
Our parents are also flawed, our grandparents are also flawed. So long as we bring that maturity to it, it's fine. I don't think being flawed is a bad thing. So since then I've realized that no matter how much you find a historical character appealing, there's no need to romanticize them, and they're never going to fit all the boxes that you'd like to tick of what makes them perfect and things like that.
See, when you are researching about lot of Maharajas, kings and queens and all that, there's a balance that you have to maintain between historical accuracy and the narrative appeal. You ultimately you are a writer and you want people to read you. So instead of saying all that, you might add something, which is very interesting to that and all that. So how do you manage this? What is that balance, the thin line that separates historical accuracy and narrative appeal?
If you're a good researcher, you don't need to add anything because the archives have everything. There's so much that's actually fun and hilarious and comical and sometimes bewildering in the archives that you really don't need to add any masala to it. For example, I wrote a column on this recently in a paper about how shoes and feet caused so much political tension in India for about 150 years. Because essentially coming into the courts of Indian Rajas, whether they were Hindu or Muslim, like when we enter our homes, we take off our shoes, right? The notion and the Indian protocol was when you enter a darbar, you have to take off your shoes. Now the British and these white officials coming hated this because for them, it is the hat you take off, not the shoes. And they found it very awkward showing their bare feet or their stockings, etc. because the idea was that it has to be covered with your shoes. And they would negotiate with these Indian Rajas saying, I want my shoes, I want the right to keep my shoes on. And the Indian Rajas would say, no, you can't keep your shoes on. This is our political prerogative. And this would continue for generations. In Hyderabad, they started asking the Nizam of Hyderabad in the 1830s or 40s for permission to keep wearing their shoes in darbar. And initially, and they also said, we want to sit on chairs, not on the floor, because they found that also very demeaning. Whereas in Indian courts, everybody sat on the floor. The ruler would be on a gaddi that was slightly higher, but everybody else was on mats, etc. on the floor. And the Nizam apparently said, well, if you want to dangle your feet, I'll dig a hole and you can dangle your feet in that, but you're not getting a chair. And eventually it was only in the 1860s, 1869 or so, when there was a 3-year-old being installed as Nizam because the old man had died and there was a new baby Nizam. And clearly he was too young to have an opinion on this. That's when they finally managed to change the protocol and they started wearing their shoes in. And interestingly, there's at least one source which says that this business of whether they could wear shoes was so politically fraught that the British resident in Hyderabad had kept the British cantonment on alert, saying that if there's any sign of public disorder, the army must step into Hyderabad. That is, there was a situation where the army had to be kept ready to come into a city because a British official was going to wear shoes when entering a darbar. Because everything, it's not just about shoes, there's political symbolism here. And it's also a way where the Nizam, who's the superior, finally has to concede that actually the British are now my overlords and I have to let them wear shoes in my darbar. So a little anecdote about shoes can actually open up again a world that is so interesting. And it's not like I have to invent these stories. If you look for it in the right places, these stories are all there.
All there. Now, coming to the concept of historical fiction, there are, we have stories set in the past, in the historical context, with fictional characters. So this actually creates a very difficult choice among the readers, so actually mistake them for actual history. Some of my students actually think Ponniyin Selvan is history. Of course, you have historical characters. For them, Arunmozhivarman is actually the historical figure. So, are you historians afraid of historical fiction?
No, not at all. I think.
And how does it affect a layman's understanding of history?
I think I like to believe that lay people are intelligent people and can tell the difference between fiction and non-fiction, at least if they apply their minds for 2 minutes. I don't think historical fiction is anything to be worried about. On the contrary, it can help generate an appetite and curiosity for the period. And I also notice in the audience we have Vasudendra sitting here who wrote a wonderful book on Vijayanagara, set in the Vijayanagara period. And it's been translated into English, etc., and Malayalam as well, I believe. And if you read that book, and if the research is solid, as it is in this case, you find that it actually brings alive that period in a very, very compelling and convincing way. And that is a win, because then the reader, my hope is the reader who reads that historical fiction will have a sense of curiosity. And the next time they're in a bookstore and they see a non-fiction book on Vijayanagara, they'll pick it up saying that I enjoyed that novel. Okay. And vice versa. I don't believe in a caste system of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate with history. As I said, it's a free country. So long as things are done well and they're done with integrity, there's nothing to fear. Whether it's historical fiction, non-fiction, whatever it is, we just have to be open to it. I'm not a purist about these things at all. I don't think we should be orthodox about these things. This is the age when all this gatekeeping is ending. Imagination can finally, in many ways, there's so much potential for imagination to run free. You can even do your non-fiction in imaginative new ways by thinking out of the box. So in that age, for me to say that historical fiction is a problem would be actually a disservice. I think it is a very, very, compelling and interesting thing to be doing.
So coming back to our topic, writing the empire, do you think that, when you are writing historical works, what is the strategy has to be followed? Like, do you have to be interested in the subject or the text or the archival documents or your personal interest in a particular topic? What interests you?
I think it's a combination of all of these things. I noticed that the bell has rung very much like in school because we're out of time. But I think it's a combination of all of these. It's never the case that it's one thing. It is what is feasible, what is possible based on what is available. I may be interested in something, but if there's very flimsy evidence, then I can't really write a serious historical book on it. So it has to be a combination of these factors that makes a project worthwhile and interesting.
So it's always a delight to talk to Manu and listen to all his podcasts and interviews and all that. But the time has, I think, is not agreeing with us. So thank you for being such a lovely audience. Thank you, Manu, for this very interesting answers.
Thank you again for being a wonderful audience. And thank you, Kaikasi, for the questions.